Welcome to your Get That Nugget for GCSE English Literature. Today we're going to be concentrating on giving you some helpful tips and frameworks to answer the Shakespeare essay in paper 1 of the Literature GCSE. We're going to be focusing on Romeo and Juliet today, and specifically on the context around Romeo and Juliet. So your assessment objectives for this essay look like this. So you need to be able to understand Romeo and Juliet, respond to Romeo and Juliet, and answer the question. You need to include quotations or references to the text. You need to analyse the way that Shakespeare gets across his point and the things that he is doing. But you also need to recognise that this play was written in the 1500s, that the world is a very different place there, and look at how that affects what we see in the play. Now, to be clear, it is not about knowing all about the history. This is not a history essay. So we're going to be looking at the context, but then looking at how we can relate that to the play. So when Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet, Queen Elizabeth was on the throne. So first of all, you have a female monarch. It would have been important that Shakespeare showed a female to be capable of ruling, capable of leading, and capable of being strong. So this relates to the way that he shows Juliet. Secondly, you have someone who refused marriage throughout her reign. Now, from the start of her reign, all of her advisors, all of the men around her wanted her to marry. She refused at every point. This links to Juliet refusing Paris. It also links to the fact that marriage in the play ends badly. Now, when Queen Elizabeth came to the throne, there were lots of people who were plotting against her, who wanted her to fail, and therefore it was important that Shakespeare was able to show that as well. So what you get throughout the play is a representation of conflict. So the play opens with the fight between the Montagues and the Capulets. This would have linked to the unrest that Elizabeth experienced throughout her reign. Furthermore, when Elizabeth came to the throne, she was a committed Protestant, whilst half of the country were committed Catholics. This meant that throughout her reign, the whole country was at war, essentially. Now, both Catholicism and Protestantism are branches of the Christian Church, and therefore, when the play opens with two households both alike in dignity, we can see that this links to the idea of the religious conflict. You have two sides of a church who have an equal claim to everything, but they are fighting each other over beliefs that they have about the way that they worship. Shakespeare obviously found this so important that he opens the play with the fight between the Montagues and the Catholics, showing us that conflict is going to be a massive part of this, showing us that the conflict is so deep-seated that it opens the play, and this relates to the London that Elizabeth ruled over. We can further link this to the separation between the two sides of London. Where you have the south below the river, which was where you would find the playhouses and the taverns, and the north, which was the wealthier side. So throughout Elizabeth's reign, you have these contrasting groups, contrasting ideas, this conflict that is really deep-seated, and Shakespeare shows that throughout the play and continues to highlight that conflict is a negative. Ultimately, it is the conflict between the Montagues and the Capulets that leads to the death of Romeo and Juliet. And so Shakespeare is showing us that conflict is a negative, that we need to put our differences aside. And so at the end of the play, when Montague and Capulet both agree to build statues for Romeo and Juliet, there is this piece that is created which represents potentially what Shakespeare wanted for the country at the time. Now, central to all of this is the church. The church is the thing that is causing that conflict. The church is the thing that is causing that divide. And we see this because at the centre of all of this is the friar. Now, without the friar, there is no marriage. Without the marriage, there is no banishment and death. Without the banishment and death, Juliet marries Paris rather than taking the potion. And therefore what Shakespeare is showing us is that at the centre of everything, at the centre of all the decisions that are made, at the centre of every event in the play, at the centre of all the problems that are created, is the church. And this again is a reference to the world that was around him at the time. So what we need to be really clear about is that we can talk about context, we need to talk about context, it's 20% of your entire mark, but it has to be how that context relates to the content of the play. So there is no point in writing that the church was really powerful at the time unless you link it to the fact that the friar is at the centre of all the action. So one way of doing this would be to say something like, Shakespeare ensures that the friar is at the centre of the action to reflect the position of the church. Okay, equally, here you could say Shakespeare begins with conflict to reflect the conflicted country that Elizabeth ruled over. Here you could say Juliet is presented as a strong female character in order to please Elizabeth. So at every point, your context is important because it further supports your analysis of the play, not because it shows what you know about Elizabethan England. Because this is the key word, relationships. It is about how that context, how that information relates to what you are writing and your response to the play, because all of these assessment objectives link together to ensure that you write a complete paragraph. Now, in order to make sure that you've understood this task, how is Shakespeare influenced by the world around him in his presentation of Verona? You need to look at how Shakespeare presents Verona, look at the presentation of Juliet, the conflict and the friar, and then explain how that relates to the world around him.